Hello and welcome to video number 65, number 4 in a series of videos where I'll be reading chapters 12 and 13 of Rulers and Evil, written by F Tupper Saussy and published in 1999. Once again, I will try to keep the commentary in this video to a minimum. Although this is another long read, I felt it necessary to keep the chapters on Lorenzo Ricci's war and early Freemasonry in the USA together to maintain continuity of thought on the connection between the two. Although Jesuitism and Masonry always appear to be at odds with each other in documented accounts, nothing could be further from the truth. Masonic religion is always working together with the aims of the Jesuits, whether in a knowing or unknowing fashion by individuals. Both are satanic cults steeped in ancient Babylonian occult symbology and ritual. Chapter 12, Lorenzo Ricci's War. Lorenzo Ricci's strategy of dividing the British imperial system can be discerned in events occurring as early as 1752. In that year, Catholic interests in America were rather poorly managed by the Congregation for the Propaganda at Rome, depending upon a tangle of ambassadors or nuncios and intermediaries in Madrid, Paris, London, and Brussels. The Jesuit mission was to consolidate these often adversarial parts into a dynamic and independent whole governed directly from the mind of the Black Papacy. In 1752, the Society of Jesus was brilliantly powerful and had been so for nearly a century. Most statesmen, a fine Jesuit historian has written, and I quote, reckoned that the society was a major force in politics, an international great power, acting primarily for its own interests, unquote. Lorenzo Ricci had been a spiritual father of this great power for nearly a year. Although that title assured him of unanimous election as Superior General upon the demise of General Luigi Centurioni, it presently endowed him with diplomatic oversight embracing the whole world. Ricci's particular geographic interests included France and its possessions in New France, the whole Mississippi Valley, from Canada and the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, and England, and its colonies in New England, all the lands to the south of French Canada, and north of Spanish Florida, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific coasts. Both empires were to a certain extent Jesuit-driven. Great Britain was run by the Catholic-loathing system of Freemasonry, whose highest adepts obeyed the revered unknown superior. France was run by Louis XV, who obeyed the same superior through his Jesuit confessor, Père de Sassy. De Sassy's good-natured ministry reduced the king's dinner on a strict fast day from 8 courses to 5, and limited his wine consumption to 3 glasses per sitting. Sun Tzu wrote, "I demand the art of making enemies move as one wishes. Those who possess that admirable art know how to arrange their men and the army they command in such a way that they make the enemy come forward toward them whenever they judge it appropriate. They know how to make generous gifts when appropriate, even to those they wish to conquer. They give to the enemy and the enemy receives. They abandon things to him and he comes to take them. They are ready for anything. They take advantage of any circumstance. They do not fully trust those whom they employ, but choose others to be their overseers. They do not count on their own strength alone, but use other means which they believe can be useful to them. They consider the men against whom they fight to be stones or pieces of wood which they have been asked to roll down a slope. You, therefore, who are commanding an army, must act in such a way that the enemy is in your hands like a round stone that you have caused to roll down a mountain 1,000 paces high. Thus it will be recognized that you have power and authority, and that you are truly worthy of the position you occupy." Unquote. Lorenzo Ricci transformed British and French colonial personnel into round stones by creating a crisis between their conflicting imperial claims to dominion in North America. In 1752, his spiritual fatherhood directed French soldiers and their Indian allies to destroy the important British colonial trading center on the upper Great Miami River. Then following the plundering, capturing, or killing, not murdering, but papally absolved extirpating of every English-speaking trader in the upper Ohio Valley that the French and Indians could locate. Although these lands were legally British, dating from a grant to Virginia by King James I in 1609, the important Virginia families failed to empathize with the misfortunes of explorer inhabitants in such remote and undeveloped wilderness. But when, toward the end of 1752, the Virginia government granted an additional 1.5 million acres of Ohio Valley land, empathies burst into bloom. Suddenly, the Virginians had something to lose, and it was being lost to a band of Roman Catholics and their Indian converts. In 1753, French engineers constructed a chain of forts connecting Lake Erie with the Ohio Valley. The governor of Virginia dispatched a small militia to confront these Catholic trespassers. Leading the militia was a recent initiate into the Fredericksburg Masonic Lodge, 21-year-old Major George Washington. Washington warned the garrison at Fort Le Boeuf that it was illegally occupying Virginia real estate, so notoriously known to be the property of the Crown of Great Britain. He read aloud the governor's demand that they depart. The French ignored him, and he returned home. Despite the clear indication that the French intended not to concede to the governor's demands, Virginia encouraged the Ohio Company to build a palisaded fort at the fork where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers joined to create the Ohio River, where Pittsburgh now stands. The government pledged Virginian troops to support the venture. Construction began in the spring of 1754. Almost immediately, French and Indians descended upon the tiny crew of woodcutters and carpenters and overwhelmed them. By the time Washington, now a lieutenant colonel, could reach the scene, he was forced by Catholic firepower to fall back to Fort Necessity. Here Washington surrendered on July the 4th. It was this clash between British and French armies that precipitated what was called by contemporary writers the Maritime War, or Great War, or Great War for the Empire, or 7 Years' War, or French and Indian Wars. It could more appropriately be called Lorenzo Ricci's War. As these rounded stones began rolling, more succumbed to Ricci's gentle touch. The colony most affected by the fighting was Meek, Pennsylvania, the colony originally settled by adherents of the renowned Quaker leader William Penn. Penn had been dead a whole generation, and ownership of his colony had devolved upon a British corporation which included some of Penn's descendants and was known austerely as the Proprietors. The Proprietors wanted wars in Pennsylvania to be fought by Pennsylvanians. The Quakers who controlled the assembly abhorred the notion of Pennsylvanians bearing arms. When the assembly voted to raise a war chest, the Quakers stepped down and out of power. First, however, they appointed their most celebrated member, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, official printer of Pennsylvania's paper currency, to sail to London and represent them against the Proprietors. Dr. Franklin, who happened to be Grand Master of Pennsylvania Freemasonry, arrived in London to find that King George II, having made peace with France as recently as 1748, favored the Proprietors. The king's attitude was, "Let Americans fight Americans." Franklin explained that Virginia's undisciplined militiamen and the pacifists of Pennsylvania were no match for seasoned French regulars and savage Indian braves. France was jeopardizing British imperial interests. The king acquiesced to Franklin's reasoning and ordered General Edward Braddock to take a small army to clear the forks of the Ohio of the French trespassers. He also sent Admiral Edward Boscawen's fleet to the Gulf of St. Lawrence to prevent the arrival of more French reinforcements in Canada. All this was in perfect obedience to Lorenzo Ricci's strategy of establishing a British military presence in America. The Crown ultimately would require the Americans to pay for this presence, which would expose the colonists to taxation from afar, which they could readily be fomented to resist. The resistance would be met with harassment, which would incite rebellion and ultimately division. The philosophical similarities between Quakers and Loyolan Gnosticism should not escape our notice. Quaker, the term, was first used by an English judge in 1650 to ridicule how the leader of that denomination, George Fox, admonished him to tremble at the word of the Lord. Fox summoned all who sought spiritual truth and peace to come out of the churches and seek an intimate personal relationship with Christ. Jesus of the Quakers spoke through inner illumination, a light available to all, having nothing to do with outward forms of ceremony, ritual, or creed. To the Quaker, every person was a walking church. Every heart was God's altar and shrine. There was no need, therefore, to attend steeple houses or pay taxes to support a state church clergy, or doff a hat to king or commoner, or fight wars, or distinguish between sex or social class. Such doctrine, of course, was highly offensive to the Church of England, and so the Quakers were mercilessly persecuted as treasonous criminals. They found a haven across the Atlantic in the colony conveniently granted by King Charles II to William Penn, one of the more outspoken English Quakers. Charles granted the land to settle a debt the Crown owed Penn's deceased father, Admiral Sir William Penn. Knowledgeable contemporaries publicly charged the younger Penn with being a Jesuit in disguise. Actually, all Catholic clergy in England were to a certain extent in disguise, thanks to a law prohibiting Roman Catholics from wearing clerical garb. Promulgated with the intent of handicapping popery, the law might as well have been written by Jesuits, as its effect reduced the Jesuit profile to nothing, the level preferred by covert militias. 18th century London was teeming with disguised Jesuit missioners trained at places like St. Omer's in moral theology, casuistry, equivocation, and mental reservation, as well as espionage, cloak and dagger diplomacy, guerrilla tactics, and the manipulation of public opinion. William Penn's higher education began at Cardinal Wolsey's endowment for the furtherance of papal supremacy, Christ Church College at Oxford. Before completing Oxford, Penn was sent by his father to the small University of Saumur, France. Penn left Saumur an accomplished propagandist, less interested in achieving specific biblical objectives. Much reading is an oppression of the mind, he would later advise his children. Than in establishing illuminated social justice through reason and natural understanding. His most influential work, the pamphlet No Cross, No Crown, published in 1669, agitated for Quaker separatism. Charles II readily accommodated Penn's agitations by launching the Great Persecution of 1682, which created enormous migrations of die-hard Protestants and Catholics alike to the American colonies. If Penn was not the Jesuit he was believed to be, he was at least a rather superior Jesuit product, another in a long train of princes, designated proprietor in Penn's case, deferring to the Quakers' dislike for titles of nobility, well trained to populate, administer, and defend their land grants in obedience to the will of the grantor. Penn's example and Franklin's after him inspired Franklin's esteemed Masonic brother Jean-François Arouet, better known as Voltaire, a founder of the Enlightenment, to memorialize Quakers as the noblest kind of born-again European. Yet well-informed Englishmen saw neither Quaker nor regeneration in Penn's curiously compromising friendship with James II, who succeeded Charles II in 1685. What possible league could a Quaker have with a king? Worse, a king converted to Roman Catholicism by Jesuits? Certainly no true Quaker could have written Penn's charter for the city of Philadelphia, which amounted to his gift of that estate to the Church of England. In the charter's preamble, Penn stated, and I quote, "I have, by virtue of the King's letters patent under the Great Seal of England, erected the said town into a borough, and do, by these presents, erect the said town and borough into a city." Unquote. The name city in every case signifies the location of a bishop's see, the seat of his authority from the Latin sedes, and the territory under his supervision. No place in England was called a city unless governed by a bishop, as in the see or city of Canterbury, see or city of York, see or city of London, of Bath and Wells, of Bristol, of Salisbury, etc. With the Philadelphia Charter, Penn erected for the persecuting Church of England a nearly invisible mechanism for recycling the very victims of its persecutions. Indeed, Penn's last will and testament, which became effective with his death in England in 1718 at the age of 74, turned all Pennsylvania into the same mechanism with these words, and I quote, "The government of my province of Pennsylvania and territories thereunto belonging, and all powers relating thereto, I give and devise to the most honorable the Earl of Oxford and Earl Mortimer, and their heirs, upon trust to dispose thereof to the Queen, Anne, or to any other person to the best advantage and profit they can." Unquote. With a stroke of Penn's quill, the children of the Quakers who had followed him out of the Church of England were literally given back. To become free of this bondage, the Quakers were obliged to align themselves with the Church of Rome, at least the Black Papacy. This alliance was facilitated by Benjamin Franklin, whose political career was built on defending the Quaker interests against the proprietary heirs, which were the Church of England. Against this common enemy, Franklin and the Quakers united, knowing or unknowingly with the designs of the Roman Church militant. And just a comment here. You can see how these parties are moving backwards and forwards from spiritual and political allegiance and are being played by the Black Pope. They're being played into a place of conflict and division. And Lorenzo Ricci is ultimately looking at the long-term outcome of this backwards and forwards play of conflict and division, so that ultimately the Church of Rome can be the winner or the gainer and take full control of the whole territory of North America, which is where we are exactly today. The papacy controls all of North America. I continue reading. While these stones rolled unstoppably toward their objective, Jesuit General Luigi Centurioni died. Early in May of 1758, the General Congregation of the Jesuits arrived at Rome to choose his successor. On the last day of the month, the congregation unanimously elected Lorenzo Ricci, the Society's spiritual father and secretary, as its 18th Black Pope. Ricci, a professor of philosophy, theology, and the classics at the Roman College, was known for his patient, placid nature, his even temper. He inherited an organization in remarkably good shape. The Latin American missions were flourishing. A mission had just been established in Poland. Everywhere the schools and colleges were prospering. In the natural sciences, Jesuits were counted among the world's leading authorities. Their presence in economic and secular government had never been more imposing. As the papal nuncio to Vienna stated in a letter to his superior at the Vatican, and I quote, "The Jesuits have the upper hand over everything. even the most prominent ministers of state, and domineer over them if they do not carry out their will." Unquote. Now, just another comment here. By this date, in 1758, the Jesuits were on every continent and virtually ruling covertly behind nearly all world governments as they stood at that time. They had established their communist communes in Paraguay and Uruguay, and they had perfected communism, which was later to be enshrined by Karl Marx in conjunction with the Jesuits as a communist manifesto and ideology. So by 1758, the Jesuits were greatly in control and of most, what would you call it, most governments on all continents worldwide. This is how great their power already was by 1758. I continue reading. But the Society's legendary power could hinder Catholic activity in the Protestant missions. To defeat Great Britain without a battle, Lorenzo Ricci required the abilities and resources of an important Maryland family, the Carrolls. The three Carrolls' sons, Daniel, John, and their first cousin Charles, all now in their 20s, had been trained in Jesuit warfare at St. Omer's. John was teaching there. Charles was studying law at the Jesuit college Louis le Grand in Paris, about to undertake further studies at London's Inner Temple. Of Daniel's activities between 1753 and 1781, very little is known. What is well known is that the Carroll lads were among the wealthiest Americans alive. These are Jesuits. This is a Jesuit family. They are the wealthiest Americans alive. This is in 1758. So we can see all the way back to this period of time, the Jesuits have a leading hand in what is happening in North America and particularly in the United States. I continue reading. The mother of Daniel and John, Eleanor Darnell, claimed direct descent from the Calverts, the owning family of original Maryland. She had come into possession of much of the land that Daniel would transfer to the District of Columbia. Charles Carroll stood to inherit America's largest private estate. Later, John Adams would label him America's richest citizen. Take note of that. Lorenzo Ricci could not win his war without the overt participation of the Carrolls. But New England was virulently Protestant. What Protestant leader would stoop to cooperate with devout Roman Catholics schooled in trickery by the all-powerful Jesuits? Would uniting with Jesuits not be laying America's future at the feet of the Bishop of Rome? In this consensus, Ricci was able to discern a valuable negative weapon. If the stones of envy and hatred were given a gentle nudge, their own weight and momentum could spectacularly blast the Society of Jesus to smithereens. With the Society out of the way, Roman Catholicism would hang in the wind, defenseless. To a Protestant's perception, the Church would no longer be a forceful contender for political power. Sun Tzu advised the ruse known in the lingo of modern covert professionals as blown cover as cover. It's important. Blown cover as cover. This is one of the ruses the Jesuits used time and time again to deceive everyone into believing they had disappeared, lost power, or were off the scene. There will be times when you will lower yourself, and others when you pretend to be afraid. Sometimes you will feign weakness so that your enemies, opening the door to presumption and pride, come to attack you unwisely. Or give out false information about the state you are in. The enemy, believing it to be true, will act in consequence toward his generals and all the officers presently at his service. Yes, sudden misfortune would bless the Society. Weakness and persecution would be transformed into magnificent new capital for building sympathetic relationships with other weak and persecuted people, such as the British colonists were destined soon to become. Without detailing his strategy, for Sun Tzu says, and I quote, "You will act in such a way that those who are inferior to you can never guess your intentions." Unquote. Lorenzo Ricci affirmed to the general congregation that storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The congregation summarily gave its understanding and obedience to the hidden design of their new superior general, who occupied, after all, the place of Jesus. It issued a call for esprit to the brotherhood at large. If God permitting it, because of his hidden designs, which we could do nothing else but adore, we are to become the butt of adversity, the Lord will not abandon those who remain attached and united to him. And as long as the society is able to go to him with an open soul and a sincere heart, no other source of strength will be necessary for it. The Prime Minister of Portugal, Sebastian the Marquis de Pombal, had been conducting what the New Catholic Encyclopedia calls, and I quote, "a long campaign of calumnies, false rumors, distorted manipulation of incidents, all intent on undermining the Jesuits' reputation by ascribing to them nefarious doctrines, purposes, and practices." Unquote. Among Pombal's allegations were that the Jesuits had incited revolts in Paraguay, a Portuguese colony, had traded illegally, had even conspired to murder the king. Pombal supported his claim with numerous anti-Jesuit tracts and inflammatory pastoral letters, which he submitted to Parliament. In the Society's defense, a group of bishops showered Pope Clement XIII with letters commending the Jesuits for their invaluable work. Clement, known by Jesuit historians as a Jesuited pope, hastened to send copies of these endorsements to Lorenzo Ricci for publication under the title Catholic Ecclesiastical Judgment for the Present Status of the Society of Jesus. Publication of these endorsements would show the world that the Society enjoyed the solid support of the Roman hierarchy. Significantly, Ricci declined to publish them. And you have to ask the question, why would he do that? Why would he not publish these publications which would glorify the Jesuits and promote them? Well, there's a strategy behind his thinking. I continue reading. On January the 19th, 1759, the Marquis de Pombal procured a royal decree expelling the Jesuits from Portugal and its overseas colonies. More than 1,000 Jesuit fathers were crammed into ships and dumped on the shores of the Papal States, then in an area in central Italy only slightly more spacious than Switzerland. 250 fathers were cast into dungeons, many perishing from maltreatment. The Portuguese crown seized all the Society's houses, churches, and colleges as well. Stones were then nudged in France. The superior of a Jesuit mission in the Caribbean, Père Lavalette, had obtained commercial credit to finance his mission in Martinique. When it happened that he could no longer pay his debt, a trading firm in Marseille alleged damages against him of more than 2 million francs. Lavalette asked Lorenzo Ricci for help. Ricci turned him down. Take note of that. Ricci declined to help a fellow Jesuit. The firm sued the Society in a French court and won. Ricci then appealed the case to the Parliament in Paris, which was more of a supreme court than a legislative body. His lawyers argued that the Society could not be held liable for personal debts of its members due to a prohibition laid down by St. Ignatius himself in the constitutions against any members doing business as a principal or partner. Although this claim was easily dismissible as a flimsy legal fiction, the court demanded evidence to support it. This required Lorenzo Ricci to produce the constitutions, which had never before been publicly revealed. When the volumes were brought to court and examined, the government attorneys had a field day. A lawyer from Brittany named La Châtelet charged that the constitutions was a handbook of, and I quote, every known form of heresy, idolatry, and superstition, which provides tutelage in suicide, legicide, blasphemy, and every kind of impurity, usury, sorcery, murder, cruelty, hatred, vendetta, insurrection, and treason." Unquote. As the La Valette case unfolded during 1759 and 1760, Benjamin Franklin's beloved Voltaire slammed the Jesuits in 2 satirical plays mounted on the Parisian stage. Why would he do that? Why would he do that? Educated in the humanities and theatrical arts by Jesuits at the College Louis le Grand, Voltaire served the society and the Catholic Church with distinction by becoming their chief critic and debunker. Much in the same way, Will Rogers served Franklin Roosevelt's administration by lampooning New Deal politicians, or in the way Keystone Cops tickled an America being transformed into a police state. Audiences at Candide howled at Jesuit buffoons strutting about self-importantly drilling their Paraguayan Indian troops. And these are the Paraguayan reductions that I mentioned previously, where the Jesuits perfected communism in South America. In the account of the sickness, confession, death, and apparition of the Jesuit birth year, the editor of a Jesuit literary review, who dies of sheer boredom, challenges the notion that the society is even worthy of existence. With his predecessor, Blaise Pascal, whose provincial letters had alerted earlier generations to the egomania of high Jesuitry, Voltaire provided a spirit of ridicule which gave Jesuit bashing the feel of good sport. And this is classic. This is the Jesuits playing both sides, demeaning the Jesuits, demeaning their order for the purpose of long-term gain, a long-term advantage. They're using psychology against the masses. So this is how the Jesuits have, over hundreds of years, perfected psychology and perfected social engineering through propaganda, and particularly through TV. Very important to note how they manipulate the public mind through education and the media, through culture. These are their formidable weapons, and they work incredibly well. Today, the whole world is deceived and propagandized by Jesuit media and education. I continue reading. Lorenzo Ricci's handling of the La Valette case resulted in a resolution passed by Parliament on August 6, 1762, condemning the Jesuits as endangering the Christian faith, disturbing the peace of the church, and in general, building up far less than they destroy. The resolution continued, "The Society of Jesus, by its very nature, is inadmissible in any properly ordered state as contrary to natural law, attacking all temporal and spiritual authority, and tending to introduce into church and state, under the specious veil of a religious institute, not an order truly aspiring towards evangelical perfection, but rather a political organization whose essence consists in a continual activity by all sorts of ways, direct and indirect, secret and public, to gain absolute independence, and then the usurpation of all authority. They outrage the laws of nature, and as enemies of the laws of France should be irrevocably expelled." And this is absolutely true. The Jesuits and the Roman Catholic Church aspires to absolute spiritual and temporal power over all mankind. And they are getting very close to it. I continue reading. Louis XV, being an absolute monarch, parliamentary resolutions were worthless without his signature. Louis being obedient to his Jesuits, it was highly unlikely that he would ever sign a resolution condemning the Jesuits. Yet, sign it he did. And why he did has remained a point of debate. Well, we can guess here why he did it. He was told to do it. Some say his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, craved vengeance against court Jesuits for implacably denying her a mass. Others say the king needed Parliament's favor to bail him out of debt. I submit that Louis signed because Lorenzo Ricci wanted him to. His handlers, his Jesuit handlers forced him to do it. We may never know, but we can see as this whole scenario unfolds, we can see how everything just fits into place, as if there was a hidden hand, and of course there is. There's a hidden shadow hand behind world events. Nothing is happening serendipitously. It's all part of a plan. And I continue reading. When the resolution became law, Ritchie released the French Jesuits from their vows. The society as an institution ceased to exist on French soil. Louis consented to allow the Jesuits to remain in France, but as regular clergy. Others went into exile. Père Lavalette, whose financial problems had brought on the debacle, was exiled by Ritchie to live the rest of his life as a private citizen in England. When the war that had begun in the Ohio Valley reached Martinique, the English occupied that tiny island and took over the Jesuit plantations, selling them, slaves and all, for more than enough money to have paid off Lavalette's debts. In the midst of their decomposing glory, the Jesuits received from Clement XIII an awesome gift designed to make welcome the most humiliating of circumstances. This was the Mass and Office of the Sacred Heart, with its icon of a realistically bloody heart plucked from Christ's ribcage and ignited by an eternal flame. Based on visions resulting from the spiritual exercises made by Saint Margaret Marie Alacoque, who lived between 1647 and 1690, as promoted by her Jesuit spiritual director, Claude de la Colombière, Sacred Heart is a Gnostic Jesuit production, centering on the Savior's perfect humanity. By devotion to my heart, Jesus supposedly revealed to Alacoque, tepid souls shall grow fervent, and fervent souls shall quickly mount to high perfection. Sacred Heart summons true believers to pay a debt of reparation for the world's sins, penance, Roman Catholic penance. The debt is payable only by prayers, penances, masses, and significantly for this epoch in the society's history, social action. John Carroll, so indispensable for the outworking of the American Revolution, was profoundly devoted to Sacred Heart. Louis XV was the effective head of the Family Compact, an agreement between reigning Bourbon monarchs to present a united front before the rest of the world on important measures. Once he had dissolved the Jesuits in France, he advised other Bourbons to do likewise, although he could not name anything to be gained politically, economically, or financially by the society's dissolution. The issue still remains puzzling and problematic, Professor Martin says, unless considered, I submit, this is the author's submission, in light of Sun Tzuan Rus. At any rate, the Bourbon Charles III of Spain followed Louis' advisory. Charles convened a special commission to prepare a master plan for ousting the Jesuits. No one could produce any hard evidence against the society, but there were plenty of rumors. A mob that had risen up to protest a law Charles had passed forbidding the wearing of wide sombreros was said to have been fomented by Jesuits. A rumor swept across Spain that the Jesuits were nursing a plot to assassinate Charles. The Jesuits supposedly had proof that the king was technically a bastard and should be deposed. None of these rumors were ever substantiated. Moreover, General Ritchie ordered the Jesuits to do nothing to dispel them. The result was that 46 of the 60 Spanish bishops decided that Spain should follow the Marquis de Pombal and oust the society. Excuse me. And so the commission drafted an expulsion order, which Charles signed on February the 27th, 1767. The order was executed by ambush, reminiscent of Philip IV's move against the Knights Templar in 1312. Charles sent out sealed envelopes marked not to be opened before sunrise of April the 2nd on pain of death to all provincial viceroys and military commanders. When sunrise came and the recipients opened their envelopes, they discovered 2 letters inside. The first ordered them to place troops around the Jesuit residences and colleges during the night of April the 2nd to arrest all Jesuits and to arrange for them to be placed aboard waiting ships at certain docks. If a single Jesuit, concluded the king, even though sick or dying, is still to be found in the area under your command after the embarkation, prepare yourself to face summary execution. Pretty strict orders from the king. I continue reading. The second letter was a copy of King Charles' original order of expulsion, which began, being swayed by just and legitimate reasons, which shall remain sealed within my royal breast forever, and then went on to say that all members of the Society of Jesus are to leave my kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and the other, formerly independent kingdoms that made up Spain. And all their goods are declared forfeit by virtue of the highest power which the Lord God Almighty has confided into my hands. The king made sure to discourage any investigation into causes. He said, "It is not for subjects to question the wisdom or to seek to interpret the decisions of their sovereign." Only days before April the 2nd, the Spanish ambassador to the Holy See presented a document from Charles to Pope Clement XIII that explained, "Your Holiness knows as well as anyone else that a sovereign's first duty is to ensure the peace of his dominions and tranquility of his subjects. In the fulfillment of this sovereign task, I have found it necessary to expel all the Jesuits residing in my kingdoms and to commit them directly to your Holiness' wise stewardship in the states of the Church. I beg your Holiness to consider that my decision is unalterable and has been made as the result of mature reflection and all due consideration for the consequences." Clement, the likelihood of whose submission to the will of Lorenzo Ricci should not be underestimated, responded in a melodramatic vein as though playing for an audience. And I quote, he said, "Of all the shocks I've had to endure in the 9 unhappy years of my pontificate, this one, of which your Majesty has informed me, is the worst." Unquote. The Pope had little more to say, except that the king may have placed himself in danger of eternal damnation. The order was executed during the night of April the 2nd and 3rd. Some 6,000 Jesuits were rounded up throughout Spain. They were crammed into the lower decks of 22 ships. In May 1767, the gruesome fleet appeared off Civitavecchia, the port of the Papal States, and amazingly was fired upon by shore artillery. The ships were denied permission to land their human cargo by order of the Pope himself, pursuant to a conference with Lorenzo Ricci. Historians are at a loss to explain why Clement, so devoted to the Jesuits, would impose such cruelty upon his beloveds in their hour of need. The most plausible answer, I would suggest, is that his understanding was obedient to the inscrutable command of his general, whose exceedingly private objective, after all, was to disqualify the Society of Jesus and the Roman Catholic Church as viable enemies of Protestantism, at least in the North American colonies. No longer enemies, they could develop personal alliances. The suffering priests, the guns of Civitavecchia, were all explained in Amiot's Sun Tzu. And this is what is said. "Your army, accustomed to not knowing your plans, will be equally unaware of the peril which threatens it. A good general takes advantage of everything, but he can only do that because he has operated in the greatest secrecy, because he knows how to remain cool-headed, and because he governs with uprightness. At the same time, however, his men are constantly misled by what they see and hear. He manages for his troops never to know what they must do, nor what orders they must receive. If his own people are unaware of his plans, how can the enemy discover them?" Over the next few months, thousands more Jesuits were expelled from the remaining Bourbon states of Naples, Parma, Malta, and Spanish America. Jesuits in French America, Quebec, and New England were left undisturbed, as were those in Austria. In October 1768, the Austrian Empress Marie Theresa Habsburg wrote her Jesuit confessor, Father Koffler, "My dear Father, There is no cause for concern. As long as I am alive, you have nothing to fear. But Maria Theresa hoped to marry her 2 daughters to Bourbon princes, Caroline to the son of the Spanish king, Marie Antoinette to the son of Louis XV. Bourbon ambassadors advised her that unless she expelled the Jesuits, she would have to look elsewhere for sons-in-law. The Empress reneged on her promise to Father Koffler, expelled the Jesuits, and the girls got their men. How about that for convenience? Marie Antoinette's marriage would end with the execution of her husband, Louis XVI, in January 1793. 9 months later, she would die the same way, decapitated by the guillotine. This device bears the name of the French revolutionist who in 1792 first suggested its use in administering the death penalty, Dr. Joseph Guillotine. Dr. Guillotine was a disestablished Jesuit. Take note of all the connections here. In January 1769, the ambassadors from France, Spain, and Portugal visited Clement XIII to demand the complete and utter suppression of the Society of Jesus. Clement called for a special consistory of the College of Cardinals to deliberate the question. But when the cardinals convened, February the 3rd, it was not to discuss Bourbon ultimatums, but to choose Clement's successor. For the 76-year-old Pope had died the night before of an apoplectic attack, said the official record, a heart attack attributed to the pressures applied by the Bourbon diplomats. For nearly 3 months, one question charged the turbulent conclave. Should the next pope be for or against the Jesuits? The cardinal's choice of Lorenzo Ganganelli was a triumph for Lorenzo Ricci. Although Ganganelli was a Franciscan, he had colleagued with Jesuits as a special consultant to the Inquisition. His celebrated book, Diatriba Theologica of 1743, had been dedicated to Ignatius Loyola. Moreover, Ganganelli literally owed his papacy to Lorenzo Ricci, as it was Ricci who had sponsored his nomination for cardinal in 1759. Almost immediately after receiving the red hat, Ganganelli had shown evidence of cooperating with General Ricci's strategy of gradually disestablishing the Society of Jesus. Oxford Book of Popes indicates a sudden and unexplainable habit change. And I quote, "Hitherto regarded as a friend of the Jesuits, Cardinal Ganganelli now distanced himself from them." Unquote. And now, a decade later, calling himself Clement XIV, Ganganelli presented what the Catholic Encyclopedia calls, in appearance, a hostile attitude toward the Jesuits, an apparent hostility, a theatrical hostility that masked and involved loyalty toward the society. Here's the diabolical machinations and deceptions that have been written into history that have fooled people time and time again into believing the wrong thing about who controls the world and who is behind the power systems in the world. I continue reading. Clement XIV would do whatever was necessary to help the society win victory without doing battle, even if it meant obliterating the society. The Bourbons needed appeasing. Hastily, Clement promised Charles III of Spain forthcoming documents necessary to proclaim to all the world the wisdom of your Majesty's decision to expel the Jesuits as unruly and rebellious subjects. He assured Louis XV of France also of a plan for the complete suppression of this society. On Monday, Thursday, 1770, Clement omitted the annual reading of In Coena Domini, or On the Lord's Supper. The omission was an astonishing statement. This celebrated bull, first proclaimed in 1568 by Pope Pius V, arrogantly reminded kings that they were but vassals of the papacy. Suddenly discontinuing this assertion flattered the royal self-importance, inviting crown heads to stay on the anti-Jesuit, anti-church track so necessary for the fulfillment of Lorenzo Ricci's secret designs in England and America. It surely evidences Clement's involvement in the strategy of feigned weakness in order to conceal what Sun Tzu called an order that nothing can interrupt. The non-reading of In Coena Domini rang the death knell of the strong-armed white papacy, as manifest by Ritchie's political theorist, Justinius Febronius, in his 1963 masterpiece on the state of the Church and the legitimate power of the Roman Pontiff, about which more presently. For more than 80 years, the papacy had supported Rome, based members of the Stuart monarchs exiled from England for being Roman Catholics. Not only did Clement XIV diminish this tradition to almost nothing, in 1772 he began extending a highly visible and most cordial hospitality to the Protestant King George III and his family. This tableau was enormously disturbing to American Protestants, who at that time were having extreme difficulties with George. The prospect of England reuniting with Rome gave them all the more reason to strive for what Lorenzo Ricci wanted, their independence. Finally, on July 21st, 1773, Clement XIV delivered on his promise by signing the brief Dominus Ac Redemptor Noster, God and our Redeemer. The brief dissolved, suppressed, disbanded, and abolished the Society of Jesus for all eternity, so as to establish a real and enduring peace within the Church. All the Jesuits' offices, authorities, and functions were declared null and void, and all their houses, colleges, hospices, and any other places occupied by them to be hereby disestablished, no matter in what province, state, or kingdom they might be found. Clement appointed 5 cardinals, an archbishop, a bishop, 2 theologians, and other ecclesiastical dignitaries to supervise the disestablishment. None of the confiscated Jesuit records, correspondence, and accounts showed any incriminating evidence. Although Lorenzo Ricci lived a short walk from the Pope's palace at St. Peter's, notice of the disestablishment was not served upon him until mid-August. The question is, why? Guards took the general into custody at his offices in number 45 Piazza del Gesù. They removed him to the English College a few blocks away. He remained there 5 weeks. Things were then happening in England and America that make Ricci's presence in the English College extraordinarily significant. We shall consider those happenings in a forthcoming chapter. Toward the end of September, Lorenzo Ricci was taken from the English College to Castel Sant'Angelo, a medieval fortress whose dungeons suggest a prison. His detention was probably less demeaning than we might imagine, as Sant'Angelo contained quite elegant rooms. Popes often used them as a convenient resort from administrative stresses. In fact, a secret underground tunnel connected Sant'Angelo to the papal palace at the Vatican. It would be consistent with Lorenzo Ricci's position and strategy for him to stay in personal, secret contact with Clement XIV by means of this tunnel. On September 22nd, 1774, the first anniversary of Ricci's detention at Sant'Angelo, Clement died. He was 69. He had suffered the last year of his life in severe depression. It was said with morbid paranoia over assassination. His corpse decomposed rapidly, feeding rumors of death by poison, rumors which his famous last words tended to confirm. Mercy, mercy, compulsus feci. I was compelled to do it. For many years afterward, historians would wonder just whom Ganganelli was addressing. God? A vengeful Jesuit assassin? Ricci? What was the it he was compelled to do? Disestablish the Jesuits? Commit suicide? The definitive answer may never be known because the Pope's personal papers and effects decomposed as rapidly as his flesh. What is quite known, though, is that the death of Clement XIV, in the words of Oxford Book of Popes, and I quote, brought the prestige of the papacy to its lowest level in centuries, unquote, which is precisely what Lorenzo Ricci needed for his American Revolution to happen. We now proceed to examine the structured darkness of the men who led the attack against the Society of Jesus. It was the same darkness from whence came not only the Englishmen who turned their kingdom into a hated tyranny, but also the Americans who advocated rebellion against that tyranny. The darkness is called Freemasonry, and it is the subject of our next chapter. Chapter 13, The Secret Bridge. Here's a quote by Stephen C. Bullock of the Revolutionary Brotherhood from 1996, and I quote, "The papal prohibition might even have encouraged Masonry by identifying opposition to the group with Catholic tyranny and superstition." Unquote. The New Catholic Encyclopedia identifies the men who attacked the Society of Jesus as the radical devotees of the rationalistic Enlightenment. Richly talented and influential writers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and other philosophers among the encyclopedists, the followers of Freemasonry, and high-placed government officials. Attacking the Jesuits was for them a step toward their ultimate objective of abolishing all religious orders, the papacy, and finally the church itself. The masterpiece of the encyclopedists, most of whom happened to be philosophers, was the monumental Encyclopedia of Sciences, Arts, and Trades of 1743 to 1751. The encyclopedia was the flame of the Enlightenment, the fulfillment of Cardinal Wolsey's dream of flooding the world with print containing learning against learning. It brought so much learning, secular learning as against scriptural learning, that it became its own paradigm, demanding radical change in existing norms. The Enlightenment called for a new age that placed reason above any church, above even the Bible. The New Age issued in the elegant neo-Gnostic religion of deism, the thinking man's alternative to Roman Catholicism and its imperious hold on the human conscience. Think about that. That is really, really important. Neo-Gnostic religion of deism, the thinking man's alternative to Roman Catholicism and its imperious hold on the human conscience. And I would maintain that today these are now virtually merged into one high occult religion. Nowhere was deism more methodically practiced than around the altars of Freemasonry. As the great Masonic scholar Albert Pike put it, here wrote Pike in his influential Morals and Dogma of 1871, "The Christian, the Hebrew, the Muslim, the Brahmin, the followers of Confucius and Zoroaster can assemble as brethren and unite in prayer to the one God who is above all gods. The brethren prayerfully climb the Gnostic pyramid of successive illumination until hopefully a oneness with the Supreme God is attained. A religion of works, working your way to heaven, working your way into God's favor. God hates this religion of works." As Pike explained, the deists, like the papacy, looked upon the Bible as something of a stumbling block. The Freemason does not pretend to dogmatic certainty, nor vainly imagine such certainty attainable. He considers that if there were no written revelation, he could safely rest the hopes that animate him and the principles that guide him on the deductions of reason and the convictions of instinct and consciousness. That's a really important point to note. The Freemason studies the wonders of the heavens, the framework and revolutions of the earth, the mysterious beauties and adaptations of animal existence, the moral and material constitution of the human creature, so fearfully and wonderfully made, and is satisfied that God is. That's it. It's nothing to do with having a personal relationship with God. I continue. Most of the philosophers, including Frederick the Great, the Protestant king of Prussia, who subsidized the entire encyclopedia project, were deistic brethren, as were the high-placed government officials who pushed for the disestablishment of the Jesuits. All the Bourbon monarchs employed as their official advisors ardent members of the Lodge. To use Professor Martin's phrase, the Marquis de Pombal of Portugal was a Mason. Charles III's advisor, the Count de Aranda, Louis XV's Minister de Tillot, and the Duc de Choiset, as well as Maria Theresa's Prince von Kaunitz and Gerhard von Swieten, all belonged to the secret brotherhood. And that is the key to the Jesuits' success and control of the world today. It's through the Masonic Brotherhood at all high levels, in all areas of human endeavor. I continue. Since it was no secret that the Enlightenment aimed to make Roman Catholicism passé, Pope Clement XII promulgated in 1728 the Constitution In Eminenti, which appeared to condemn Freemasonry thusly. And it reads, Condemnatio Societatis de Conventiculorum de Freemasons, under the penalty ipso facto incurred or excommunication, absolution from it being reserved to Pontifex Maximus, or the Pope. Freemasons of whatever sect or religion confederate together in a close and inscrutable bond according to secret laws and orders agreed upon between them, and bind themselves as well by strict oath taken on the Bible as by the imprecations of heavy punishments to preserve their mysteries with inviolable secrecy. The great mischiefs which generally accrue from secret bodies are antagonists to civil and canonical laws. Wherefore, by the advice of the cardinals and of our mere motion, and from the plenitude of the apostolic power, we do condemn and prohibit the meetings of the above-named Society of Freemasons. We strictly command that no one, under any pretext or color, dare to presume to promote, favor, admit, or conceal in their houses members of assemblies of this abominable order, nor in any way aid or assist in their meeting in any place, or to administer medicine to them in their sickness, or in any manner, directly or indirectly, by themselves or others, afford them counsel, or help in their hour of trial and affliction, or persuade others to join said order. So this seems on the surface to be a condemnation, outright condemnation of Freemasonry by the Pope, right? But it's all a show. It's a ruse. While Eminenti's stern rhetoric, which was renewed by Benedict XIV in 1751, seems to dig a wide ocean between Catholicism and Freemasonry, its fruits tell another story. Why, for example, were the Bourbon monarchs, all of them Roman Catholic, never penalized or excommunicated for admitting, promoting, and favoring Masonic advisors? And why, a decade after the Marquis de Pombal had shipped the Jesuits out of Portugal, did Clement XIV send an appeasing nuncio to the Portuguese court, elevate Pombal's brother to bishop, and confirm all Pombal's nominees in bishoprics? The answer, of course, is contained in the bull's title, which provides that absolution from penalties or excommunication is reserved to Pontifex Maximus, to the Pope only. That is to say, associating with the abomination of Freemasonry, if done for a cause valuable to the papacy, such as weakening the Jesuits to the point everybody assumes they're no longer a threat to Protestantism, will be absolved by the papacy. Given the historical context, does any other answer make sense? The leading Jesuit bashers were not only Freemasons, they were also the product of Jesuit learning against learning. It was the Ratio Studiorum, the Medici Library's Gnostic wisdom absorbed in an ambience of casuistry, equivocation, mental reservation, and obedience of the understanding, combined with smatterings of Holy Scripture, usually filtered through the commentaries of church doctors, that had turned 2 centuries of Jesuited students into secular philosophers. The Ratio Studiorum dictated the form and scope of the encyclopedia, which in turn codified the Enlightenment paradigm, whose deistic litany was preached around the altars of Freemasonry. Hold Freemasonry up to the light and you cannot help but see the black papacy's watermark. Isn't it reasonable, given the circumstances, that the G in the center of the familiar Masonic emblem represents the initial of Jesu, the residence of the Black Popes at the Jesuits' world headquarters at number 5, Borgo Sancto Spiritu in Rome? Freemasons wouldn't suspect this, nor would Jesuits. It would be information reserved uniquely to the unknown superior who shares what he knows with no one. Your knowledge will serve you without their wishes, said Sun Tzu. Your enemies will serve you without their wishes, said Sun Tzu, or even their knowledge. Freemasonry was the natural, the reasonable, the only intelligent way for the Roman Catholic Church to control A, the ongoing affront of Protestantism, B, the increase in divine right kings heading their own national churches independent of Vatican control, and C, the incredible explosion of international mercantilism, like the aquatic creature whose mouth resembles a comfortable resting place to its prey. The lodges were a sagacious recycling of the old Templar infrastructure into a dynamic spiritual and economic brotherhood that gave Protestants, Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, agnostics, and anyone else an opportunity to build a better life outside Roman Catholicism, yet still under the Church's superintending eye. For Sun Tzu said, and I quote, "The general sees all, hears all, does all, and in appearance is not involved with anything," unquote. The Jesuit general is the disembodied eye substituting for the pyramid's missing capstone, the stone the builders rejected. The lodge's secrecy and its condemnation by the Church were essential to sustaining the integrity of both institutions. And so the deepest Masonic secret, the secret that not even their grandest masters could penetrate, was that all their secrets were known to one man alone, the superior general of the Society of Jesus. This should not surprise anyone aware of how thoroughly Freemasonry is suffused with Jesuitic technique. Both Freemasonry and the Society of Jesus are A, humanist religious orders, B, secretive, C, fraternal, D, socially conscientious and politically active, questing like Aeneas, the prototypical Roman, for the greatest good for the greatest number. Both orders, E, hold tradition, reason, and experience in equal, if not greater esteem than the Bible. And F, employ carefully structured programs of Gnostic visualization to achieve an ever-increasing knowledge of the divine. G, condone the end justifies the means. And H, require absolute obedience secured by a blood oath to a hierarchy of superiors, culminating in the Jesuit general whose orders are so wisely suited to the recipient that they are obeyed as though willed by the recipient himself. The first recorded member of American Freemasonry was Daniel Cox, who was constituted Provincial Grand Master of the provinces of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania on June 5, 1730, on a deputation granted by the Duke of Norfolk, Grand Master of Masons in England. Evidently, Cox was an industrious recruiter. Minutes of a meeting of the Grand Lodge of London on January 29, 1731 reflect that Cox's health was proposed and drank as Provincial Grand Master of North America. Daniel Cox was actually a junior, according to Sidney Hayden's Washington and His Compeers of 1868. He was the son of Dr. Daniel Cox of England, who was physician to the Queen of Charles II. Dr. Cox must be presumed a Roman Catholic sympathizer, as both Charles and his Queen were Catholics. The Queen, Catherine of Braganza, from Portugal, flaunted a huge Vatican entourage for which she was continually harassed by death plots. Charles converted to Catholicism in exchange for money from Louis XIV of France under the terms of the Treaty of Dover. The junior Daniel Cox deserves wider recognition as an American visionary, or at least the sole apologist of some undisclosed visionary. 13 years before Benjamin Franklin's proposal of a colonial union to the Albany Congress in 1754, for which Franklin is credited with being the first to suggest the United States, Cox published in England a dissertation promoting a scheme to settle an extensive tract of country lying on the Gulf of Mexico, owned by his father, the Queen's physician. The dissertation, entitled A Description of the English Province of Carolina by the Spaniards called Florida and by the French La Louisiane, promoted the elder Cox's tract as an English province allied with New England against the Spanish, French, and Indians. It called for all the colonies appertaining to the Crown of Great Britain on the northern continent of America to be united under a legal, regular, and firm establishment, over which a lieutenant or supreme governor may be constituted and appointed to preside on the spot, to whom the governors of each colony shall be subordinate. With this union of governments under one president, Cox foresaw a great council or general convention of the estates of the colonies to meet together, consult, and advise for the good of the whole. These United States would provide for their mutual defense and safety, as well as, if necessary, for offense and invasion of their enemies, independently of the protections of the British Crown. Of course, these imaginings became reality 40 years later with the fulfillment of Lorenzo Ricci's strategy for dividing the British Empire. Considering the elements involved, lands owned by the Catholic Queen's physician, lands managed and promoted by the physician's son, who is a Freemason deputed to generate an American brotherhood by the 8th Duke of Norfolk, who himself was a member of England's premier Roman Catholic family, Cox's dissertation appears to be the earliest formatting of the colonial conscience to divisive thinking by agents of the Black Papacy. The Duke of Norfolk, Grand Master of Masons in England, was also known as Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel. His nephew Henry, Lord Arundel, occupied Wardour Castle near Tisbury in Wiltshire at the time Clement XIV disestablished the Jesuits. We will see how, in the summer of 1773, it was to Lord Arundel's castle that John Carroll repaired when civil authorities closed down the Jesuit school in Liège, Belgium, where Carroll had been teaching. For a year, Carroll stayed at Wardour, serving as the Arundel family's tutor and chaplain before sailing for America to participate in the Revolution. 33rd degree Masonic scholar Manly P. Hall, in his Gnostic Extravaganza, Secret Teachings of All Ages, an encyclopedic outline of Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian symbolical philosophy of 1988, remarked that, and I quote, not only were many founders of the United States government Masons, but they received aid from a secret and august body existing in Europe, which helped them to establish this country for a peculiar and particular purpose known only to the initiated few. Unquote. Most histories of the American government skim over the Masonic presence. Americans like their history told in high-definition icons of good and evil, liberty and tyranny, heroism and treason, might and right. They won't buy a heritage polluted by dark spots of mystery. Yet the greater part of American governmental heritage is almost wholly mysterious. The man best qualified to become our country's greatest historian, certainly man with the most complete access to primary sources in the revolutionary cause, was Charles Thomson. An authentic classical scholar, a discreet Protestant steeped in Medici learning, Thomson was known as the perpetual secretary of the Continental Congress. He inscribed minutes of every congressional session from 1774 until ratification of the Constitution in 1789. With William Barton, a Freemason, he designed the Great Seal of the United States of America. The choice of its Virgilian mottos is credited exclusively to Thomson. Among his contemporaries, Charles Thomson's name was synonymous with truth. So accurate were his minutes of Pennsylvania's negotiations with the Delaware Indians that the Delawares called him Wegulamoend, or the man who talks the truth. When he would take his daily reports of congressional proceedings to the streets, eager mobs would cry, and I quote, "Here comes Charles Thomson," Here comes the truth." Unquote. Once the Constitution was ratified, Charles Thomson retired to Harriton, his country home in Bryn Mawr. He destroyed his personal papers relative to the creation of the new republic. An article by Kenneth Bowling in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography of 1976 says that Thomson actually wrote a lengthy history of the Revolution, which he also destroyed. Thomson biographer J. Edwin Hendricks of Wake Forest suggests a fate other than destruction, alluding to persistent rumors that the Thomson papers are in the Pennsylvania Masonic records. Professor Hendricks assured me personally that numerous inquiries have failed to reflect Thomson's membership in Pennsylvania Masonry. Whether Thomson destroyed his history or surrendered it to the crypt of secrecy, it is clear that he knew there were certain elements in the formation of American government that must be ignored. If the truth were known, he told friends darkly, and I quote, "Many careers would be tarnished and the leadership of the nation would be weakened." Unquote. And so, Charles Thomson occupied the remaining 40 years of his life translating the Septuagint, the Greek language Bible, into English. Still, he was frequently requested to write the definitive insider's history of the Revolution. Dr. Benjamin Rush overheard Thomson's reply to one such request and recorded it in his diary. He said, and I quote, "No," said he, "I ought not, for I should contradict all the histories of the great events of the Revolution, and show by my account of men, motives, and measures that we are wholly indebted to the agency of Providence for its successful issue. Let the world admire the supposed wisdom and valor of our great men. Perhaps they may adopt the qualities that have been ascribed to them, and thus good may be done. I shall not undeceive future generations." Unquote. So here we have a Mason who refused to tell the truth, so that the record as it stood could remain to deceive future generations. So how wicked is that? I continue. What I believe Thomson was meaning to say is simply that no historical account of the American Revolution can be truthful unless it discloses the role played by the agency of Providence. Notice that Thomson does not use the word providence alone, which was understood in his day to mean God or Christ. He does not say we are wholly indebted to God or we are wholly indebted to Christ, but rather to the agency thereof. If Thomson knew the word agency was a synonym for vicar, and I can't imagine that a professional linguist wouldn't, and if he knew that the popes had been called vicars of Christ since the 5th century, and I can't imagine that a biblical scholar of his quality wouldn't, then Thomson was most likely saying, and I quote, "We are wholly indebted to the vicar of Christ, that is, the Roman papacy." Unquote. And I truly believe this to be the case myself. I continue reading. But what a ridiculous statement to the post-revolutionary American mindset. Who would have believed such an outrageous notion, coming from even the man who talks the truth? The embattled, degenerate, dying papacy could not possibly have affected the revolution. Anyone foolish enough to run with this idea would have crashed headlong into a wall of ridicule. For Thomson, there was no future in telling what he knew. Since he chose not to undeceive future generations, the American people have lived according to histories that can be contradicted by truth. They have been served by careers and leaders that truth could tarnish and weaken. They seem comfortable in their deception, which is generally the case among consenting subjects to Roman rule. Let's move now to the next chapter, wherein we shall see how the Jesuits, which we now recognize as the unsung architects of the Enlightenment, supplied the American colonists a philosophical basis for rebelling against Great Britain. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video, where I'll be reading chapters 14 to 17. Please note again that I'm thinking about making an additional video as an addendum to these readings with some commentary on this remarkable book, as I feel some things may need clarification or augmentation. Thank you for listening, and God bless.